Hello viewers, this is George from Ireland. Today I'm going to tell you about Magna Carta for GCSE history. What's the background to Magna Carta? Well, King John became king in 1199. He was constantly fighting a war against France over Normandy, which was a possession of his family in France. He was losing that war. It was extremely costly to pay for soldiers to buy horses and weapons. He was constantly having to increase taxes on people, which of course was deeply unpopular. People were trying not to pay to hide their money. He imprisoned people he suspected of having money that they weren't paying him. If a man died and his son wanted to inherit his property, King John would say, "You can only inherit that property if you pay me so much money." In those days, of course, men had all the power and women were almost never in charge. He sometimes took hostages from people who he thought might rebel against them, taking their children. "If you rebel against me, your children will be killed." If people were on trial for some crime, he would delay the trial until they paid him money. He would deny justice to people unless they paid him extra money. There was a thing called scutage, which meant shield money. It's from the Latin word for shield, scutum, because landowners had to serve a certain numbers of days in the army for the king each year. They had to bring so many soldiers and horses with them. And instead of going to fight for the king in France, provide soldiers and horses, some of these wealthy landowners could pay money instead. But he kept increasing the amount of scutage, shield money they had to pay, increasing the frequency with which they had to pay it. Because remember, then there was a feudal system, like a pyramid with the king at the top, a few barons who were wealthy landowners, posh men below him, and most people were peasants, were poor farmers, paying rent to use farmland on which they produced food to survive. Many people were serfs. Serfs were semi-slaves who had to do some unpaid work as well as producing food for themselves. Okay, so number two, what happened in this situation? A revolt, people rebelling against the king. Simon de Montfort led this. Simon de Montfort had the title Earl of Leicester, which is why there's a Leicester-Montfort University. And so Simon de Montfort was a baron. He was a big landowner, a rich man. And so these posh guys felt it was wrong. They should be having to pay so much to the king. The king was very unpopular. The king had fallen out with the Pope. Remember, everybody in England was a Christian, specifically a Catholic Christian. The Pope, who lives in Rome, is the leader of the Catholic Church. And King John sort of take church land. And the church wouldn't conduct any services. Most people were very, very religious in those days. They thought if they died, they might go to hell because the Pope was punishing England generally by not allowing church services. So the rebellion was really an anti-tax rebellion. It was also about justice and the courts being denied to people unless they paid lots of money to the king. The barons wanted scutage, shield money, to be limited in amount and how often it was paid. So it's not really about the ordinary people, the poor, rebelling. Some of them were involved, but they were just ordered what to do by the barons. That's the landowners. Remember, 9 out of 10 people were farmers back then because technology was so basic. We needed lots of people to work on farms. So number three, although King John, he kissed and made up with the Pope, not literally, they made an agreement the churches were reopened. The highest priest in England is the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time suggested negotiation between King John and the barons because King John was losing. King John did have a few barons on his side. So King John was in Windsor Castle. The barons dominated London and much of the countryside. They agreed to meet at Runnymede. Runnymede is near the River Thames. It's not far from Windsor Castle, which was one of King John's strongholds. Runnymede is not an island. That's a myth from the 19th century. You can go and see the meadow there. So the document had been prepared over a few days and it was sealed. It was not signed. It means wax was heated up and dropped onto the document and then a stamp was stamped onto it. This stamp had various images and words in Latin associated with King John to show that the king agreed to it. Because King John didn't sign it, some people mistakenly believe that King John could not read or write, which is not true. He certainly could and wrote other documents. Magna Carta is in Latin, by the way. Almost all official documents were in Latin. Most people spoke English. The barons usually spoke French because they'd come from France only about 150 years before. but government documents were always in Latin at the time. Magna Carta means Great Charter in Latin. Remember, never call it the Magna Carta, just Magna Carta. What's the content of Magna Carta? It granted rights. Some of these rights had already existed, but King John was repeating them, now accepting them. He will not delay or deny justice in the courts to anyone, which he'd been doing for money. There was the right to a fair trial, the right to property. People did not have to pay to inherit their property. And this only applied to free men, which meant barons, some of the knights. The knights were reasonably well off, would own a horse and a suit of armour to do some fighting. Some of the free farmers, so that's a minority of people. Most people were serfs, as I say, semi-slaves, very poor farmers who had to do some unpaid work as well as doing their own farming. There is nothing about democracy, not that word, not that idea in Magna Carta, nothing about voting in Parliament at all. There are lots of misconceptions. People later wrongly imagined these things were in Magna Carta. Some of it's about rights to hunt in the forest, to fish, saying that the king won't interfere with the Catholic Church in England, which he had previously done, because the church owned so much property, a third of all the land in England. King John several years earlier had been trying to take some of it for himself because he wanted the money so much. Let me see, it became very significant afterwards when people said, this is the touchstone of liberty, this is what really made us free, right to a fair trial, and so on. Now, in the short term, it wasn't significant because the very next year, King John repudiated it, said it doesn't count, I was forced to do it because of the rebellion. The Pope completely took his side. Pope Innocent III said, yes, King John is right. Magna Carta doesn't count. He doesn't have to keep any of these promises. He only did it at sword point, more or less. King John died the next year in 1216, very shortly after having said that the Magna Carta was not valid. His young son, Henry III, became king. Henry III was too young to effectively rule on his own, but he later reissued Magna Carta, and later kings accepted that it was valid. In the longer term, it became much more important. And indeed, Simon de Montfort, who'd been instrumental in forcing King John to agree Magna Carta, he dominated the early years of Henry III. We won't go into what happened to Simon de Montfort later. So those are the vital things you need to know about Magna Carta to describe it in accurate language. Use formal words, don't use slang words. I've said things like posh guy, just to make sure you grasp the idea. But if you're writing an answer, don't say that sort of thing. So you want to know what Magna Carta is, why it happened, why is it important, why did it matter later on, you know, some of the key points in Magna Carta, and just describe it in accurate English, spelling accurately if possible, writing grammatically, and so forth. That's all.